He wasn't trying to find anything, he was trying to forget, but some things don't stay buried no matter how hard you try. The first strike of the hammer echoed across the empty farmland. Just before dawn, a dull metallic crack that didn't belong to stone. Daniel Hayes stood there, breathing slow, shoulders heavy under a worn flannel shirt, his hands calloused, his grip steady, but his eyes somewhere far away, the kind of eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little. The land stretched wide around him. 50 acres of dry soil and stubborn weeds in rural Kansas, the kind of place where the wind never really stops, just shifts direction, like it's searching for something. To the old farmhouse behind him leaned slightly to one side, paint peeled by years of sun and silence, and beside him Rex stood still, a German shepherd with a dark sable coat, ears high, eyes fixed not on Daniel, but on the boulder that sat half buried in the center of the field. It wasn't just any rock, it was the kind that didn't belong, like it had been placed there, not grown there. And for 3 days now Rex hadn't left it, not to eat, not to rest, not even when Daniel called him back inside. He would circle it slowly, nose low, then stop and stare, as if listening to something deep beneath the earth, something no human could hear. And that was what finally got to Daniel, not the dog's stubbornness, but the feeling that the silence around that rock wasn't empty, it was holding something. The morning air carried the scent of dust and rust, and something faintly metallic, like old rain on forgotten tools. Daniel lifted the hammer again, the muscles in his arms tightening as he brought it down harder. This time the sound was different, sharper, hollow. It made Rex step back just once, then move closer again, tail low, not afraid, just certain. Daniel paused, sweat forming along his brow despite the cool air. He reached out and pressed his palm against the surface of the stone. It was colder than it should have been, like it had never seen sunlight. A strange thought crossed his mind, uninvited, unwelcome. What if this wasn't just a rock? What if it was a lid? He shook it off, exhaling slowly. No more ghosts, not here, not now, not after all these years. He had come back to this land to sell it, to let it go, to leave behind everything that still whispered his name in the quiet hours. But Rex wouldn't let him, not this time. The dog let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something deeper, something that seemed to come from memory itself. Daniel looked at him, really looked at him, and for a brief moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, man and dog, standing between the past and something waiting to be uncovered. Don't start something you can't finish, he muttered under his breath, but his hands had already decided. He raised the hammer again and brought it down with everything he had. The crack that followed didn't sound like stone breaking, it sounded like something opening. The second strike split deeper, and this time the sound did not echo outward, it sank inward, like the earth itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to let it go. Daniel lowered the hammer slowly, his arms trembling, not from effort, but from something colder, something that crept up his spine and settled behind his ribs. Rex stepped forward, immediately nose pressed against the thin fracture that now traced across the surface of the boulder. A faint draft slipped through the crack, cool and stale, carrying a scent that did not belong to open fields or fresh air. It smelled like time sealed away, like metal and dust, and something older. Daniel crouched down, brushing his fingers along the break. Loose grit fell away easily, revealing a narrow seam just wide enough to wedge his hand into. He hesitated, not because he was afraid of what might be inside, but because some part of him already knew this was not about to give him peace. Rex let out a soft sound again, not urgent, not frantic, but steady, as if urging him forward, not warning him back. Daniel exhaled slowly, then pulled at the stone. The fractured piece shifted with resistance before giving way with a dull grinding sound, revealing a hollow space beneath, no larger than a small storage compartment, but too deliberate to be natural. Inside the darkness sat a metal box, rectangular edges worn by decades, its surface dulled by rust and time, yet intact, as if it had been waiting. Daniel stared at it without moving for several seconds. The world around him seemed to fall quiet. Even the wind paused, as if listening. Rex sat beside him, now perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on the opening. Daniel reached inside, his hand brushing against the cold metal, and for a moment his breath caught, not from fear, but from recognition, a strange, unexplainable pull, like touching something that had always belonged to him. Even before he knew it, he lifted the box carefully, setting it on the ground beside the broken stone. The hinges creaked faintly when he brushed away the dirt, thick flakes of rust breaking off under his fingers. There was no lock, no seal, just time holding it closed. He glanced at Rex, who watched without blinking, then back at the box. Do not be foolish, he muttered under his breath, but his voice lacked conviction. He opened it slowly. Inside lay a folded piece of cloth wrapped tightly around something small and Solid the fabric was faded once dark now. Worn to a dull gray, Daniel reached in again, unwrapping it layer by layer until the object inside caught the morning light. A watch, simple silver, worn at the edges, the glass scratched, but unbroken. Daniel froze, his hand, hovering inches above it. The air seemed to thin around him, his chest tightening in a way he had not felt in years. He knew that watch not from memory alone, but from something deeper, something that lived in the spaces between memories. His father used to wear it every single day, never took it off, not even when working the fields, not even when sleep came heavy after long summers. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. That is not possible, he whispered, but the watch was real, solid in his hand, its weight undeniable. Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer, his body warm against Daniel's leg, grounding him in the moment, but it did not stop the past from rising. Daniel turned the watch over slowly, and there it was, faint but still visible, the engraving on the back, initials he had not spoken aloud in decades. The world tilted just slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to remind him that everything he thought had been settled, everything he had buried alongside this land, was no longer where he left it, and somewhere beneath that broken stone, beneath the silence that had lasted 60 years, something had been waiting, not to be found, but to be remembered. Daniel did not move for a long time, the watch resting in his palm, heavier than it had any right to be, the faint ticking long gone, yet somehow he could still hear it echoing in the back of his mind like a memory refusing to fade. The wind returned slowly, brushing across the open field, carrying the dry scent of wheat and dust, but it no longer felt empty. It felt crowded with something unseen, something waiting. Rex lowered his head and nudged Daniel's wrist, gently, not impatient, not urging, just reminding him to stay here, to breathe. Daniel blinked once, then again, pulling himself back from the edge of a past he had spent decades trying to outrun. He wrapped the watch again, carefully placing it beside the open box. His hands moved slower, now more deliberate, as if every motion carried weight he could not yet explain. Inside the box, beneath the cloth, there was more. He had seen it in the corner of his eye, but had not dared to reach for it until now. A folded stack of papers, aged to a yellowed brown, edges curled, ink faint, but still present, like whispers pressed into fiber. Daniel hesitated, his fingers hovering above them, his chest tightening with the quiet certainty that whatever was written there would not bring closure, it would bring answers, and answers had a way of asking more questions than a man could carry. Rex sat down fully beside him, his body steady, his presence constant. Daniel exhaled and unfolded the first page. The paper cracked softly under the movement, the sound sharp in the stillness. He scanned the lines slowly, his eyes adjusting to the faded handwriting. At first, it was nothing more than names, dates, land measurements, coordinates marked in careful detail. But then something shifted. The language changed from records to statements, from statements to something that felt like confession. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read further. The names were familiar, not strangers, not outsiders, but men from the town, men his father had once trusted, men who had stood at their kitchen table, shared meals, shaken hands, and called him friend. The air grew heavier with each line, the story forming piece by piece, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and undeniable, like truth often is. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry as the realization settled in this land had not been lost to bad luck or failing crops. It had been taken not by force, but by silence, by agreements written in shadows, by decisions made behind closed doors, and his father had known something he was not supposed to know. Rex shifted slightly, his ears flicking toward the open field, then back to Daniel, as if sensing the change not in the air, but in him. Daniel turned to the last page, his hands no longer steady. The handwriting there was different, rushed, uneven, as if written under weight, the final lines barely legible, but clear enough for meaning. Daniel read them once, then again, slower this time, letting each word settle, like dust finding its place. He closed his eyes briefly, the paper trembling in his grip, not from fear, not from anger, but from something quieter, something deeper, a kind of understanding that does not come with noise only. With stillness, Rex leaned into him, pressing his shoulder against Daniel's side, grounding him again in the present. The box, the watch, the papers, they were not random, they were not forgotten, they had been hidden carefully, deliberately, and not to protect a secret, but to preserve it until someone was ready to see it. Daniel opened his eyes, looking out across the land, the same land he had planned to leave behind, the same land he thought had nothing left to give, and for the first time since returning he did not see emptiness. He saw layers, he saw time, he saw something unfinished, and beneath it all he felt it, not as a thought, not as a memory, But as something steady, something certain, this was not the end of something. This was the beginning of something that had been waiting far longer than he had been gone. The paper did not leave his hands, even as the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the field. Daniel remained kneeling beside the broken stone, his mind moving slower now, not because it could not keep up, but because it was finally choosing to listen. Every word he had read settled into place like pieces of something that had always existed just out of sight. The names, the dates, the quiet agreements. They did not shout, they did not accuse, they simply existed, and that was what made them heavier. Rex stood and took a few steps forward, circling the boulder once more before stopping at a patch of earth just beyond the opening. His nose hovered there, unmoving. Then he looked back at Daniel, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty, as if to say, there is more. Daniel followed, slowly rising to his feet, his joints stiff from time and memory alike. The ground felt different beneath his boots, not softer, not harder, just known in a way he had not allowed himself to feel before. He stepped closer to where Rex stood. The dog lowered his head again, pawing lightly at the dirt, not digging, not frantic, just enough to disturb the surface. Daniel crouched beside him, brushing the soil aside with his hand. The earth gave easily, looser than it should have been, like it had been turned once long ago, and then left alone. His fingers struck something solid, not stone, not metal, but wood worn smooth by time. He cleared more of the dirt, revealing the edge of a small plank, weathered but intact, set deliberately beneath the surface. Daniel paused, his breath catching again, not from fear, but from the weight of what this meant. The box had not been alone. Whatever had been hidden here had been layered, protected piece by piece. Rex sat back, watching him closely, his ears forward, his body still. Daniel slid his fingers under the edge of the plank and lifted it gently. The wood resisted at first, then came free with a soft pull, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside lay another bundle wrapped in cloth, darker than the first, tied with a thin piece of twine that had long since faded. Daniel stared at it for a moment, longer than he meant to. Something about it felt different, not older, not newer, but closer, like it had been placed there last, not first. He reached in, carefully lifting it out. The weight was lighter than the box, but somehow heavier. In meaning, he sat back on his heels, untying the twine slowly, each movement measured, deliberate, as if rushing would break something unseen. The cloth unfolded, revealing a small leather journal, its cover cracked, but preserved, the edges worn smooth from hands that had once held it. Often Daniel's fingers brushed over the surface, tracing the faint indentation of initials pressed into the leather. He knew those initials too, not from childhood memory, but from something quieter, something that had lingered in the background of stories never fully told. Rex leaned in closer, his breath warm against Daniel's arm. As the man opened the journal, the pages inside were filled with handwriting, tighter, more personal than the documents before. This was not record keeping, this was thought, this was witness. Daniel read the first line and felt something shift, not outside, not in the land, but inside himself. A voice not spoken aloud, but carried through ink across decades, steady, calm, unafraid. It did not sound like a man hiding, it sounded like a man leaving something behind, not for the world, but for one person. Daniel continued reading, each sentence drawing him deeper into a past that was no longer distant, but present. The story unfolded quietly, not of loss, but of knowing, not of defeat, but of truth, carried without noise. And as the wind moved gently across the open field, brushing against his shoulders and through Rex's fur, Daniel understood something he had not before. Some things are not buried to be forgotten. They are buried to be found by the one who is ready to see them. The page trembled slightly in Daniel's hands, not because the wind had picked up, but because something inside him had finally begun to move the handwriting on. The first entry was steady, deliberate, the kind of writing that came from a man who had already made peace with what he knew and what he could not change. Daniel read slowly, letting each word settle, not rushing, not skipping, as if the meaning might disappear if he moved too quickly. The journal did not begin with fear, it began with clarity. It spoke of the land not as property, but as promise, something passed down, not just through blood, but through trust. And then line by line the tone shifted, not sharply, but enough to be felt. There were mentions of meetings that happened after sunset, of conversations that ended too quickly when others entered the room, of documents that did not match what had been agreed upon, and names, always the same names, the ones Daniel had already seen in the papers inside the metal box. Rex remained beside him, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest, his presence steady like a quiet anchor. Daniel turned the page, the paper softer, now worn thinner. By time the words grew more personal, less careful. there was a weight to them that could not be mistaken. His father had known something was wrong long before anything had been taken, but he had not acted, not immediately, not because he was weak, but because he had believed and people believed that what was built over years could not be undone in silence. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as he read that part: the belief in others, the trust and handshake agreements, the quiet assumption that right would remain right even when no one was looking. The journal did not accuse, it did not raise its voice, it simply recorded what had been seen and what had been understood, and that made it heavier than any anger Daniel had ever carried. Rex shifted slightly, his head tilting as if listening to something beyond the field. But he did not move away. Daniel turned another page, this one shorter, fewer words, but they struck deeper. His father had written about a decision not to confront, not yet, not until he was certain, not until he could prove what he felt was happening. And then there was a line that made Daniel stop completely, his breath catching in his chest. The words were simple, but they carried something final. If anything happens to me, this land does not belong to them. It never did. Daniel stared at that sentence for a long time, the ink slightly smudged, as if the pen had lingered there longer than intended, as if the moment itself had weighed more than the words could carry. Rex leaned closer, resting his head gently against Daniel's shoulder, not pushing, not interrupting, just there. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, the sound of the wind returning, brushing through the dry grass around them, carrying with it a faint rustle that sounded almost like distant voices. But there were no voices, only memory and truth finding their way back to the surface. He opened his eyes again and continued. The final pages were not filled with fear, they were filled with instruction, not orders, not commands, but guidance, quiet, deliberate, as if written for someone who would one day stand exactly where Daniel was now, unsure, but present. There were directions not to locations, but to understanding, reminders that what is hidden is not always lost, and what is taken in silence can be returned in truth. Daniel lowered the journal slowly, his hands steadier now than before, not because the weight had lessened, but because he had chosen to carry it. Rex lifted his head, meeting Daniel's gaze, their eyes holding for a brief moment in the stillness. No words passed between them. None were needed. Daniel looked back out across the land, the same field, the same sky, the same worn house in the distance, but nothing felt the same anymore. The ground beneath him was no longer just soil. It was history, it was witness, it was waiting, and somewhere deep within that quiet realization, something shifted from burden to purpose, not loud, not sudden, just steady, like a door opening that had been closed for far too long. The journal rested on his knee, but Daniel was no longer reading. He was listening, not to sound, but to something deeper that settled into the space behind his thoughts, the kind of quiet that only comes when truth has nowhere left to hide. The wind moved across the field again, slower this time, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and distant rain clouds gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. Rex stood up, first, his posture shifting, not tense, not alert, but aware, like a soldier who recognizes when a moment has changed. Daniel followed his gaze out toward the far edge of the property, where an old fence line leaned unevenly against time, the wood posts gray and splintered, wires sagging between them. That fence had always marked the boundary, at least that was what he had been told growing up. That was where their land ended and someone else's began. But now, standing there with the journal still open in his hand, that line did not feel certain anymore. It felt placed, like the boulder, like the box, like everything else that had been set down, not by nature, but by decision. Daniel pushed himself to his feet slowly, the stiffness in his legs reminding him of years spent carrying things he never spoke about. Rex moved ahead a few steps, then stopped, turning back just enough to make sure Daniel followed. There was no urgency in him, only direction. Daniel walked toward the fence, each step steady, each breath measured. The ground uneven beneath his boots, small rocks shifting under weight. But he did not look down. His eyes stayed forward, fixed on that quiet line that no longer made sense. The closer he got, the more he noticed details he had ignored before, the way the posts were not evenly spaced, the way the wire dipped too low in places, as if it had been put up quickly, not carefully, as if it was meant to hold an idea more than a boundary. Rex reached the fence first, lowering his head and sniffing along the base of one of the posts, his nose tracing the edge where wood met soil. Then he stepped over the sagging wire, without hesitation, pausing on the other side to look back. Daniel stopped at the line, his chest tightening slightly, not from fear, but from something harder to name. A lifetime of belief does not disappear easily, even when it is proven wrong. He looked down at the ground beneath him, then At the journal still in his hand, then back at Rex waiting quietly on the other side. "You were never meant to stop here," he said softly, the words not directed at the dog, but at something older, something that had shaped him. Without asking, he lifted his foot and stepped over the wire, the movement simple, almost small, but it carried a weight he could feel all the way through his chest. Rex turned and continued forward, now moving along a narrow stretch of land that had always been just out of reach. Tall grass brushed against his legs, dry and whispering as he walked. Daniel followed a few paces behind, the field opening wider as they moved deeper into it. The farmhouse now slightly farther away, the broken boulder no longer visible from where they stood. And yet Daniel did not feel lost. He felt aligned, like he was walking a path that had been waiting, not marked, not obvious, but there all along. Rex slowed again, stopping near a cluster of older trees, their branches thin, leaves sparse, casting shifting shadows across the ground. The air felt cooler here, quieter, as if the land itself held its breath. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes scanning the area, not searching, just seeing, and for the first time, he understood something that had been written without being said. The truth was not hidden in one place, it was layered across all of it, the land, the objects, the lines drawn, and the ones erased. And now standing there with Rex beside him, and the journal still warm in his hands, Daniel realized he was no longer uncovering the past, he was stepping into it. The trees did not look like much at first, just a thin line of aging trunks spaced unevenly across the edge of the field, their bark worn pale by sun and seasons. But as Daniel stepped closer, something about them felt deliberate, not planted, but chosen. The ground beneath them was firmer, less disturbed than the soil around the boulder, as if whatever had happened here had been left untouched on purpose. Rex moved slowly between the trunks, his nose low, tracing invisible paths that only he could understand. Then he stopped near the base of the largest tree, its roots rising slightly above the ground, twisting like fingers holding onto something buried. Long before Daniel arrived, Daniel approached carefully, the journal still in one hand, the other brushing against the rough bark as he circled the tree. Once then again, the air here was cooler, the kind of cool that lingers even when the sun is high, and it carried that same faint metallic scent, not strong, not overwhelming, just present, like a memory that refuses to fade. Rex let out a soft breath and sat down directly beside one of the exposed roots, his eyes lifting to meet Daniel, as if waiting not for permission, but for recognition. Daniel crouched slowly, his knees pressing into the firm soil as he studied the ground more closely. The dirt was packed tighter here, not freshly turned like near the boulder, but settled in a way that suggested it had once been disturbed, then left to rest. His fingers brushed along the edge of the root, and that was when he saw it, not something hidden, not completely, just something overlooked, a thin line in the earth, too straight, too clean to be natural. Daniel leaned closer, his breath slowing as he traced it with his fingertips. It formed a narrow outline, rectangular, subtle, but unmistakable. Rex shifted slightly, leaning closer, as well, his presence steady as ever. Daniel glanced back at the journal, flipping carefully through the pages until he found a section near the end where the handwriting had grown smaller, more precise, as if space had been running out. His eyes scanned quickly until they stopped on a line that seemed to anchor everything that had come before. Not all truths are written, some are marked where only the patient will notice. Daniel looked from the page back to the ground, the connection immediate, undeniable. He set the journal gently beside him and began brushing away the top layer of soil, not digging, not rushing, just clearing enough to reveal what lay beneath. The outline grew clearer with each movement, the edges defined by something just below the surface, would again like the plank near the boulder, but larger, older. Daniel paused, his hands resting on the earth, his chest rising and falling steadily as he considered what he was about to uncover. This was no longer about curiosity, it was about confirmation, about stepping fully into a truth that had been waiting longer than he had been alive. Rex lowered himself beside him, his body close enough that Daniel could feel the warmth through his sleeve, a quiet reminder that he was not alone. Daniel exhaled slowly, then pressed his fingers along the edge of the hidden panel. The soil loosened just enough for him to get a grip, and with a careful, steady pull, the wood lifted, revealing a deeper compartment beneath, darker than the one before, and filled not with objects, but with space that had been protected, sealed, and left undisturbed. Daniel leaned forward, peering into it, the light catching just enough to reveal shapes inside, not immediately clear, not immediately understood, but real. His hand hovered above the opening, his breath catching again, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that whatever lay beneath this tree was not placed here by accident. and not meant to be found by just anyone. Rex remained still beside him, his eyes fixed on the opening, unwavering, patient, as if he had known all along where this path would lead, and now Daniel did too. This was not the end of the trail. This was where the truth had been waiting the longest. Daniel did not reach in right away. He stayed there for a moment, his hand hovering above the opening, as if the space itself required permission to be entered. The light filtered through the branches above, casting thin, shifting lines across the interior, just enough to reveal outlines without fully explaining them. The air inside felt different, cooler, still carrying that same quiet metallic scent, but deeper now, layered with something older, something preserved. Rex leaned forward slightly, his ears alert, but his body calm, his presence steady as always. Daniel finally moved, lowering his hand into the compartment slowly, his fingers brushing against something smooth, not cold like metal, not rough like wood, but something in between. He closed his hand around it and lifted it into the light. It was a small box, darker than the first one, but better kept, its edges intact, its surface worn by time, but not broken. Daniel turned it in his hands, noticing the faint markings along the side, not decorative, not random, but intentional initials. Again, but not his father's, different ones he recognized from the journal, from the names written between the lines, the ones that had stayed too quiet for too long. His jaw tightened slightly, not from anger, but from clarity. Rex shifted his weight, pressing gently against Daniel's leg, as if grounding him once more. Daniel opened the box carefully, the hinges moving without protest, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. Inside were documents, not loose, not scattered, but arranged with care, tied together with a thin strip of cloth. Daniel untied it slowly, unfolding the papers one by one. The ink was darker here, more preserved, the handwriting sharper, more controlled. These were not records, these were agreements, signatures lined neatly at the bottom of each page, names that matched the ones from the journal, names that had shaped the land. Without ever stepping fully into the light, Daniel read in silence, his eyes moving steadily across each line. The language was clear, precise, no confusion, no uncertainty. Land transferred, not sold. Boundaries redrawn, not by nature, but by decision. Ownership shifted without witness, without record. Beyond what lay in his hands, Rex lowered himself beside him again, resting his head lightly against Daniel's knee, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the only sound in the stillness. Daniel turned to the final page, his fingers slowing, as if instinctively understanding that this was where everything would meet. The last line was short, no flourish, no hesitation, just a single statement signed and dated, a confirmation of what had been done. And when Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it entered, not because he was surprised, but because it was real, because it had always been real, and now it was no longer hidden. He closed the box, gently placing it beside him, his gaze lifting from the papers to the land around him, the trees, the field, the distant line of the house. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing was the same anymore. Rex lifted his head, meeting Daniel's eyes, and in that quiet exchange something passed between them, not words, not instruction, just understanding. Daniel reached out, placing his hand on Rex's head, his fingers pressing lightly into the thick fur, a simple gesture, but one that carried everything. He had not said the truth, had not been lost, it had been waiting, and now that it had been found, it would not return to silence. Daniel did not stand right away, he remained there beneath the tree, the open box beside him, the journal resting quietly in the grass, and Rex close enough that he could feel the steady warmth of him against his side. The wind moved through the branches above, soft, now almost gentle, carrying with it a different kind of silence, not the empty kind he had known for years, but something fuller, something that held meaning instead of absence. He looked down at his hands, the faint traces of dirt along his fingers, the lines of time etched deeper into his skin, and for the first time in a long while they did not feel empty, they felt like they had finally touched something real. Rex shifted slightly, pressing his head into Daniel's palm, and Daniel responded, without thinking, his hands settling into the familiar place behind the dog ears, slow, steady movements, the kind that needed no words, the kind that said everything without saying anything at all. Daniel exhaled a long, quiet breath and let his gaze drift out across the land, the fence line now behind him, the Boulder far out of sight, the house waiting in the distance, unchanged, and yet no longer the same. This land had carried more than soil, more than seasons. It had carried truth, quietly, patiently waiting for someone willing to listen. And now that truth had found its way back into the open, not through force, not through anger, but through time, through trust, through a dog that refused to walk away. Daniel reached for the journal, again his fingers brushing over the worn leather cover, Before closing it gently, he placed it beside the box, then rested his hand there for a moment longer, as if acknowledging not just what had been found, but what it meant. He did not rush to gather everything. He did not move with urgency. There was no need for that anymore. The answers were not going anywhere. They had already waited 60 years. They could wait a few moments more. Rex stood first, stepping forward, then stopping, turning back, just enough to make sure Daniel would follow, and Daniel did, rising slowly to his feet, the weight in his chest no longer heavy, but grounded like something that belonged there. They walked together back through the trees, through the tall grass that brushed softly against their legs, the field opening wide before them, the sky stretching above in quiet blue, the farmhouse coming into clearer view with each step. And as they moved, Daniel noticed something small but undeniable. The land did not feel like something he was leaving anymore. It felt like something he was stepping into, not as a burden, not as a past to carry, but as something to hold with care. When they reached the broken fence line, Daniel paused again, looking down at the sagging wire, then stepping over it without hesitation. This time there was no weight in the movement, no resistance, only understanding. Rex moved ahead, already crossing back into the space that had once been defined as his, and now felt simply like home. Daniel followed the path back toward the boulder, the broken stone still split open, the empty compartment beneath it no longer hidden, and for a moment, he stopped there, looking at it, not with questions, not with doubt, but with a quiet kind of respect. Some things are not meant to stay buried, and some bonds are not meant to be broken, not by time, not by silence, not by the choices of others. He reached out, placing his hand briefly against the rough surface of the stone, then turned away, continuing toward the house. Rex at his side, the sun now higher, casting light across everything equally, no shadows deep enough to hide what had been found. And as Daniel stepped onto the worn wooden porch, the boards creaking softly beneath his boots, he paused once more, not because he was unsure, but because he understood something clearly now. This was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one that would finally be told, and somewhere behind him, carried in the quiet rhythm of 4 steady paws, was the reason it had been found at all.